Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy Historian. If you are listening late at night, perhaps with the lights dimmed and the world outside already slowing down, you are exactly where this story belongs. Tonight's journey does not begin with a dramatic event, a famous name, or a precise date carved into stone. Instead, it begins with a question so simple that it feels almost modern, and yet so old that history itself seems to shrug gently in response. When did people start smoking weed? It sounds like the sort of question that expects a clear answer, perhaps a year, a place, a culture, or a single decisive moment when someone, somewhere, took the first breath of fragrant smoke and unknowingly began a tradition that would echo through centuries. But history, as it often does, refuses to be so neat. There is no ceremony, no recorded first attempt, no ancient scroll announcing that on a particular evening humanity crossed an invisible line. And that is precisely what makes this story interesting. Because long before laws, debates, or modern assumptions ever entered the picture, there was simply a plant. A quiet one. One that grew where people lived, worked, rested, and buried their dead. It did not arrive with fanfare. Nor was it greeted with suspicion. It was simply there, woven into the landscape in much the same way as grasses, reeds, and herbs that early humans came to know by touch, smell, and habit rather than by name. Tonight, we are not here to argue, persuade, or judge. This is not a story about right or wrong, or even about pleasure and danger. This is a historical walk, taken slowly, through the long and surprisingly calm relationship between humans and a plant that modern conversations have made loud. In its earliest chapters, however, that relationship was anything but noisy. In fact, if we could step quietly into the distant past, we might be surprised by how little attention this plant received at all. Imagine a world without categories like recreational, medicinal, or illegal. A world where plants were not classified by effect but by usefulness, familiarity, and presence. People did not ask what a plant could do to the mind before they asked what it could do for daily life. They noticed whether it could be woven, eaten, burned, or used to soothe an aching body after long hours of work. And so, before anyone ever thought of smoke drifting upward for enjoyment or escape, this plant existed simply as part of the environment. It did not demand attention. It did not announce itself as special. It waited, patiently, as history unfolded around it. What makes this story especially suited for a quiet evening is the absence of urgency. There is no sudden discovery here, no dramatic turning point. Instead, there is a slow accumulation of habits, observations, and small choices made by people who had no idea they were contributing to something future generations would debate so intensely. Tonight's journey will move gently, just as history itself did. We will pass through ancient fields and shared living spaces, through rituals performed not for spectacle but for meaning, and through moments when smoke was simply another element in the air, no more remarkable than the warmth of fire or the flicker of shadows on stone walls. So as you settle in, let the modern meanings loosen their grip for a while. Allow this story to exist in its original quiet form. History, after all, is often most revealing when it whispers rather than shouts. And with that, let us begin where this story truly belongs, not with smoke, not with intention, but with a plant that had not yet become a symbol of anything at all. Long before anyone thought about inhaling smoke for pleasure, ritual, or reflection, humans lived in a world defined by plants. Their days were shaped by what grew nearby, what could be gathered, and what could be coaxed from the soil with patience rather than precision. In this world, plants were not mysterious substances to be controlled or feared, they were familiar neighbors, each with its own quiet role to play. Cannabis was one of these neighbors. It did not announce itself with dramatic effects or demand careful handling. It grew readily in certain climates, producing fibers strong enough to be noticed and seeds abundant enough to be useful. To early humans, this made it practical rather than extraordinary. It was not a temptation, nor was it a curiosity. It was simply another plant that happened to be there. If we imagine an ancient settlement, We might picture people moving through their days with little separation between tasks. Gathering food, preparing fibers, tending fires, and resting were not neatly divided into categories. Everything flowed together, and plants were encountered in the same way, handled, processed, and used without much philosophical reflection. In such a setting, cannabis did not stand out. It did not carry a special name whispered with reverence. It was woven into ropes, cords, and rough textiles long before anyone wondered about its effects when burned. Its seeds were valued as nourishment, its stalks as material. These were tangible benefits, easily observed and passed down through simple instruction rather than written knowledge. This is an important detail, and one that modern discussions often overlook. Before cannabis was something people used, it was something people lived alongside. It was known by the hands before it was known by the mind. The idea of smoking anything at all was not originally tied to enjoyment. Fire was central to survival, and smoke was an unavoidable companion. Plants of all kinds were burned, sometimes deliberately, sometimes incidentally. The air around early human settlements was often filled with the scent of whatever happened to be drying, cooking, or discarded into the flames. In this environment, the concept of isolating one plant for its mental effects would have seemed unnecessary. There was no expectation that smoke should do anything beyond rise, drift, and eventually disappear. And yet, familiarity has a way of inviting curiosity, even when it is unspoken. Over generations, people noticed patterns. Some plants burned differently. Some produced scents that lingered. Some seemed to soften the edges of long days or alter the atmosphere of shared spaces in subtle ways. These observations were not framed as experiments. They were absorbed quietly, woven into collective memory without being formally acknowledged. Cannabis, at this stage, was still not special. It had not yet crossed the invisible line between usefulness and meaning. It was a plant before it was a habit, and certainly before it was an identity or a controversy. What is striking is how long this stage lasted. For centuries, and likely millennia, cannabis existed in this unremarkable state. People grew it, handled it, and burned it without attaching a story to it. It did not demand explanation, and so none was given. This quiet beginning matters because it reminds us that the relationship between humans and cannabis was not born out of desire for escape or transformation. It emerged from proximity, from routine, from the simple act of living close to the land and using what was available. Only much later would smoke begin to mean something more. Only later would people pause to notice how it made them feel, or what it seemed to do to the space between thought and sensation. But those moments belong to another part of the story. For now, the plant remains exactly what it was at the start, present, useful, and largely unnoticed, waiting patiently as history takes its time. If cannabis spent its earliest years as a plant that barely attracted notice, then it did so in very good company. Ancient life was filled with plants that quietly earned their place not through spectacle, but through reliability. In a world without supermarkets, factories, or written manuals, usefulness was the highest compliment a plant could receive, and cannabis earned that compliment early on. To understand this phase of the story, it helps to imagine a time when agriculture was still learning how to be agriculture. Fields were small, tools were simple, and success depended less on precision than on patience. Crops were valued not for a single purpose, but for how many roles they could play. A plant that could feed, clothe, and bind objects together was not just helpful, it was practical in the deepest sense of the word. Cannabis fit neatly into this category. Its fibers were strong, flexible, and surprisingly cooperative. They could be twisted into rope, woven into coarse fabric, or used to reinforce tools that otherwise would not survive long-term use. In daily life, this mattered far more than any subtle effect the plant might have when burned. A rope that held together was more valuable than a fleeting sensation. And early societies were nothing if not pragmatic. This practical relationship shaped how people thought about the plant, or rather, how little they thought about it. cannabis was not surrounded by stories or taboos. It did not occupy a special place in myth or ritual at this stage. It was grown, harvested, processed, and used with the same quiet familiarity as flax or reeds. There was no reason to speak of it in hushed tones, because it did not ask to be treated differently. What is especially interesting is how this ordinariness protected cannabis from scrutiny. When a plant becomes essential to everyday life, it often becomes invisible. People stop asking questions about it because it has already proven its worth. Cannabis was useful, predictable, and cooperative, which meant it blended seamlessly into the background of ancient economies. In this context, smoke still meant very little. Fires were everywhere, and smoke followed naturally. Plants were burned for warmth, for cooking, for clearing space, and sometimes simply because there was no reason not to. The scent of burning vegetation was a constant presence, mingling with food, earth, and sweat. No single plant dominated the air long enough to claim attention. And yet, there is something quietly amusing about how close cannabis was to becoming something else entirely, without anyone noticing at the time. Imagine bundles of dried stalks set aside after fibers had been stripped away. Imagine these remnants tossed casually into a fire, producing smoke that was neither sought nor avoided. No one paused to analyze how it felt. No one wrote observations. The smoke rose, the fire crackled, and life continued. If there were subtle effects, they were absorbed into the general fatigue and rhythm of daily existence. This lack of attention is not a failure of curiosity, it is a sign of priorities. Ancient people were not uninterested in their inner lives, but survival demanded focus. A plant that strengthened tools and clothing was far more valuable than one that altered perception in ways that had no immediate application. Cannabis, during this long agricultural phase, was respected without being romanticized. It was cultivated deliberately, but without ceremony. Its seeds were saved, its fibers processed, and its presence accepted as part of the natural order. There was no sense that it needed explanation or regulation, because it had not yet crossed into the realm of meaning. What modern listeners may find surprising is how long this stage persisted. Centuries passed with cannabis firmly planted in the category of useful things. Entire generations lived and died without ever considering that the plant might offer anything beyond material benefit. This was not ignorance, it was contentment with what worked. And perhaps this is where the quiet humor of history reveals itself. Today, cannabis is often discussed as though it arrived suddenly, bringing change and controversy in its wake. But for most of its early existence, it was about as controversial as rope. It did not disrupt social order. It did not demand rules. It simply did its job. Only slowly, almost accidentally, did people begin to notice that not all uses of a plant were equally tangible. Somewhere along the way, attention drifted from what cannabis could make to what it might do. This shift did not occur overnight, nor did it happen everywhere at once. It emerged unevenly, shaped by environment, culture, and moments of stillness when survival loosened its grip just enough to allow reflection. But at this point in the story, we are not there yet. Cannabis remains an agricultural companion, defined by texture rather than sensation, by strength rather than subtlety. Its role is to hold things together, literally and figuratively. It binds tools, supports shelters, and quietly reinforces daily life. The idea that this same plant would one day be discussed in whispers, celebrated, feared, or regulated would have seemed unnecessary, if not slightly absurd. After all, it had already proven itself by the most ancient standard of all: it was useful. And for a very long time, that was more than enough. By the time cannabis had firmly established itself as an ordinary agricultural companion, something subtle began to happen, not everywhere, not all at once, and certainly not with any sense of intention. This was not a discovery announced with excitement, nor was it a turning point marked by decision. It was, instead, one of those quiet shifts that history often hides inside routine. Smoke, after all, had always been there. fires were central to ancient life. They warmed shelters, cooked food, hardened tools, and gathered people together when daylight faded. Smoke drifted through living spaces with little ceremony, curling around conversations, clinging to clothing, and settling into hair and skin. It was not considered remarkable. It was simply part of being human in a world powered by flame. But not all smoke behaved exactly the same way. Over time, people began to notice small differences, not because they were looking for them, but because the human mind is quietly attentive even when it pretends not to be. Some fires smelled sharper, some heavier, some lingered longer in enclosed spaces. Occasionally, smoke softened the edges of a long day or made shared moments feel slightly less rigid, slightly more fluid. Cannabis smoke was one of many, and at first, it did not stand apart. It was mixed with the smoke of other plants, other remnants, other materials thrown into fires without much thought. There was no attempt to isolate it, no effort to preserve it for a specific purpose. If it had an effect, it was absorbed into the general haze of daily life, indistinguishable from fatigue, warmth, and the simple relief of rest. What matters here is not what people felt, but how little they felt compelled to explain it. Early humans did not have a habit of separating cause from effect unless survival demanded it. A headache relieved by rest did not require analysis. A shift in mood around a fire did not inspire documentation. Sensations were experienced, not dissected. They passed through the body and mind the way weather passes through a landscape, noticed only in retrospect, if at all. In communal spaces, smoke was a shared experience. People gathered close together, not to experiment, but to be warm, to eat, to talk, or simply to exist in proximity after a long day. Any subtle changes in perception were communal as well, spreading gently through a group rather than settling on an individual. This is an important distinction, and one that modern perspectives often miss. There was no concept of using smoke to change oneself. There was only the experience of being together, with fire at the center and time moving more slowly than it would later in written history. Cannabis smoke did not create a separate state of mind so much as it blended into an already flexible one, shaped by exhaustion, ritual, and the natural rhythm of daylight and darkness. If anything, the humor of this stage lies in its complete lack of ambition. Cannabis was not being used in the sense we understand today. It was encountered. It happened to be present when fires burned, and its properties revealed themselves quietly, without invitation. No one paused to say, "This feels different." And if someone did notice, there was no particular reason to share the observation. In a world where daily survival left little room for introspection, such subtleties were luxuries, easily overlooked. Yet history has a way of remembering what people did not bother to record. Over generations, small patterns accumulated. Certain plants were burned more often in certain contexts. Some were avoided, others tolerated, a few favored without explanation. Cannabis drifted slowly toward this last category, not because it demanded attention, but because it never caused trouble. It did not make fires unpredictable. It did not irritate the body in obvious ways. It did not disrupt communal rhythms. And so it remained present. This presence was quiet enough to avoid suspicion, but persistent enough to become familiar. It did not announce itself as special, but it did not disappear either. It hovered at the edge of awareness, waiting for conditions that would allow people to linger just a little longer in its presence. Those conditions did not arise everywhere, nor did they arise quickly. They emerged in moments when life allowed pauses, during gatherings that were not strictly necessary, during ceremonies that stretched beyond practicality, during nights when conversation lasted longer than planned. Still, at this stage, cannabis had not yet crossed into meaning. It was not symbolic. It was not sacred. It was not forbidden. It was simply noticeable, in the gentlest sense of the word. The smoke lingered a little longer. The firelight felt a little softer. Time loosened its grip just enough to be felt rather than measured. But no one yet asked why. That question would come later. when societies grew complex enough to wonder about the unseen, and when shared experiences began to carry weight beyond immediate survival. For now, cannabis remained suspended between usefulness and significance, neither demanding attention nor escaping it entirely. It existed in the background of human life, just as it had from the beginning, quiet, patient, and entirely unconcerned with the meanings that future generations would place upon it. History, as always, was in no hurry. At some point, long before anyone thought to write things down, human life began to develop pauses that were not strictly necessary. Moments that existed beyond hunger, shelter, or exhaustion. These pauses did not arrive suddenly, nor were they announced. They grew out of repetition, out of memory, out of the simple human habit of doing certain things the same way, again and again, until they felt important. This was where meaning quietly entered the fire. Ritual, in its earliest form, did not look like ceremony. It looked like habit with attention. A fire lit at a particular time. A gathering held at a familiar place. A sequence of actions repeated not because they were efficient, but because they felt right. And in these moments, smoke was no longer just a byproduct. It became part of the atmosphere people intentionally returned to. Cannabis did not create these rituals, but it fit into them with remarkable ease. As communities grew more stable, people began to notice patterns not only in nature, but in themselves. Certain gatherings felt calmer. Certain nights stretched longer. Certain fires invited stories instead of silence. The smoke rising from these moments carried more than warmth. It carried mood, memory, and an unspoken sense that something was happening beyond the visible. Still, nothing was named. Ancient societies did not rush to explain internal experience. They lived inside it. When something felt different, the response was not to analyze, but to repeat. And so cannabis found itself present again and again in contexts that were already charged with significance: seasonal transitions, communal feasts, rites marking change rather than necessity. What matters is not that cannabis was singled out, but that it was allowed to remain. Other plants were burned and discarded. Some irritated the lungs. Some smelled unpleasant. Some made fires unpredictable. Cannabis, however, behaved politely. It burned evenly. Its scent was distinctive but not offensive. Its effects, if noticed at all, were gentle enough to blend into the rhythm of gathering rather than disrupt it. And so it stayed. In these early ritual-like moments, smoke became a kind of boundary. It softened the edges between people. It blurred the sharpness of individual thought and replaced it with something shared. Conversation flowed differently. Silence felt less empty. Time, already unmeasured, became even less demanding. This was not intoxication as later cultures would understand it. It was atmosphere. The humor of history lies in how easily modern minds mistake intention for design. No ancient group sat around deciding to alter consciousness. Consciousness was already flexible. Life was already filled with uncertainty, myth, and unseen forces. Smoke simply joined that world without resistance. As rituals slowly took shape, they absorbed whatever was already present. Fire, smoke, rhythm, repetition. Cannabis was not elevated to sacred status at this stage, but it was no longer invisible. It became part of the language of gathering. Even if that language had no words yet. There is something deeply human about this phase. Meaning did not arrive as belief. It arrived as feeling. A sense that certain moments mattered more than others, even if no one could say why. Cannabis smoke drifted through these moments not as a message, but as a texture. It filled the air the way dusk fills the sky, noticeable only when you stop moving. Importantly, this was still communal. Cannabis was not yet a personal experience. It belonged to the group, to the shared fire, to the collective pause. Any changes in perception were diffused, softened by laughter, conversation, and the simple presence of others. No one was chasing a sensation. No one was trying to escape reality. Reality itself was already porous, shaped by myth, environment, and the constant negotiation between seen and unseen. And so cannabis slipped into meaning without being asked to explain itself. Over generations, these moments accumulated. Fires were remembered. Gatherings were anticipated. Smoke became associated not just with warmth, but with togetherness. With marking time. With acknowledging that something had shifted, even if no one could articulate what that shift was. This is where cannabis began to carry memory. Not written memory, but emotional memory. The kind that lives in the body rather than the mind. The kind that says, without words, this feels familiar, or we have been here before. Still, nothing about this was dramatic. There were no visions carved into stone. No gods named after plants. No rules imposed. Cannabis remained quietly cooperative. Content to be part of the background rather than the focus. But history, patient as ever, was preparing the next turn. Because once meaning exists, even unspoken meaning, it invites interpretation. And once interpretation begins, humans rarely stop at observation. They wonder. They connect. They imagine causes where once there were only experiences. Cannabis was about to enter a new phase, not because it changed, but because humans did. By the time cannabis drifted into moments of meaning, humans had already begun asking questions that had no clear answers. Why did sickness come without warning? Why did some dreams linger longer than others? Why did certain places feel heavy, while others felt calm? These questions did not demand solutions in the modern sense. They invited stories, gestures, and practices that made uncertainty easier to live with. And slowly, almost without intention, smoke was invited to help. This was not yet the age of priests or formal doctrine. There were no manuals explaining how plants worked or why bodies reacted as they did. Knowledge lived in observation and repetition. If something seemed to ease pain, it was remembered. If something calmed fear, it was used again. And if something appeared to soften the boundary between the physical and the unseen, it was treated with quiet respect. Cannabis began to be noticed in this way. Not as a miracle, not as a cure-all, but as a gentle companion to moments of discomfort. When aches lingered after long days of labor, when sleep came unevenly, when anxiety hovered like a low cloud, the familiar smoke sometimes accompanied relief. No one spoke of chemicals or mechanisms. The experience itself was explanation enough. This is where cannabis first brushed against the idea of healing. Healing, at this time, was not strictly medical. It was emotional, communal, and symbolic all at once. To be healed was not just to remove pain, but to restore balance. To feel aligned again with one's body, one's group, and the rhythms of the world. Cannabis fit comfortably into this worldview because it did not overpower. It did not demand attention. It eased rather than interrupted. In gatherings meant to soothe rather than celebrate, smoke took on a slightly different character. It was quieter. Slower. The fire burned low. Conversation softened. Silence became acceptable. In these spaces, cannabis was no longer just atmosphere. It became a participant. Still, nothing was formalized. There were no dosages measured with care. No rituals written into tradition. Cannabis was used because it felt appropriate, not because it was prescribed. Its role varied from place to place, from group to group, shaped by climate, culture, and the stories people told themselves about why things worked. And this flexibility mattered. Because it allowed cannabis to be interpreted rather than defined. One group might associate it with calm after grief. Another might link it to endurance during hardship. Another still might simply notice that evenings felt longer and more bearable when smoke was present. Meaning accumulated quietly. As generations passed, these associations began to settle into something more recognizable. Certain plants became connected to certain outcomes. Certain practices were repeated not just because they felt good, but because they were believed to help. Cannabis, without ever being named as sacred, began to occupy a space near that word. It is important to pause here and notice what did not happen. Cannabis did not suddenly become a god. It did not demand worship. It did not replace other traditions. It slipped into existing frameworks, adapting to them rather than reshaping them. Humans, after all, are far more interested in fitting new experiences into old stories than in rewriting those stories entirely. This is where the humor of history gently returns. Modern discussions often frame cannabis as something discovered, defined, and controlled. But in this period, control was not the goal. Understanding was not the priority. Comfort was. Continuity was. The simple hope that tomorrow might feel slightly less uncertain than today. Cannabis offered that hope without explanation. In healing contexts, it became associated with listening rather than acting. The healer was not someone who fixed the body, but someone who sat with it. Smoke lingered. Time stretched. The body was allowed to respond in its own way. If relief came, it was welcomed. If it did not, the moment was still considered meaningful. There was no failure here. And because cannabis did not promise certainty, it avoided disappointment. It became reliable precisely because it did not claim to be powerful. It was subtle, predictable in its gentleness, a presence rather than a solution. As these practices continued, they began to shape how people thought about the boundary between physical sensation and internal experience. Pain was not just pain. Calm was not just calm. These states carried significance, lessons, and sometimes messages, even if those messages were never clearly spoken. Smoke, once again, became a bridge. Not a bridge to visions or prophecy, but to attention. To noticing the body. To sitting with discomfort rather than fleeing from it. In a world without anesthesia, without modern medicine, this mattered deeply. Cannabis did not remove hardship. It softened its edges. And in doing so, it earned a quiet place in the human toolkit, not as a cure, not as a sacrament, but as a helper in moments when control was impossible and patience was required. History often celebrates dramatic shifts, sudden revelations, and bold declarations. But most human practices grow the way moss grows, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Until one day you realize it has been there all along. By the end of this phase, cannabis was no longer just a plant that burned well. It was something people turned to when answers were unavailable and endurance was needed. It was present in moments of vulnerability, not triumph. And that, perhaps, is why it stayed. Because the next step in its journey would not come from curiosity alone, but from belief. And belief, once formed, rarely remains gentle.
By the time cannabis had quietly settled into moments of healing and rest, something subtle began to change. Not in the plant itself, but in the way people noticed their own thoughts when smoke was nearby. The fire still crackled. The night air still cooled the skin. But attention turned inward more easily, as if the world had gently leaned back to make space. No one announced this shift. It simply happened. People began to describe experiences that were difficult to explain but easy to recognize. Time felt less demanding. Thoughts wandered without urgency. Laughter arrived slowly and stayed longer than expected. Silence, once awkward, became comfortable. Cannabis did not create these moments, but it seemed to allow them. And so, smoke became something like a mirror. Not a mirror that showed faces, but one that reflected moods, memories, and the quiet movement of the mind. People noticed how thoughts rose and fell, how worry softened when left alone, how attention drifted like smoke itself, never fixed, never entirely gone. Ancient cultures did not rush to label this experience. They were not interested in separating imagination from perception. If something felt meaningful, that feeling was enough. If something felt strange but gentle, it was allowed to remain. This is where cannabis fit perfectly. It did not demand belief. It did not insist on interpretation. It simply made certain inner spaces easier to visit. Around the fire, conversation became slower, less purposeful. Stories wandered. Silence stretched. No one felt compelled to explain why. From a modern perspective, this phase is almost humorous in its simplicity. There was no attempt to analyze the mind or control the experience. People were content to notice, and noticing, in a world filled with labor and uncertainty, was already a rare luxury. Cannabis offered no answers, but it made questions feel less heavy. It allowed people to sit with their thoughts rather than wrestle them, to observe worry instead of chasing it away, to let the mind roam without fear of getting lost. In this sense, smoke did not change reality. It softened the way reality was held. This inward turn did not lead to visions or revelations. It led to familiarity. People became familiar with their own inner rhythms, the same way they knew the seasons or the weather. Some nights felt calm. Some felt restless. All were acceptable. And importantly, this experience remained communal. Cannabis was not yet a private escape. It belonged to shared fires and shared time. Any inward reflection happened alongside others, buffered by laughter, presence, and the simple reassurance of not being alone. Whatever the smoke revealed, it did so gently, without isolating anyone from the group. In this way, cannabis became associated with reflection rather than transformation. It did not promise insight. It offered space. And in a world where constant attention was required for survival, space was precious. History often focuses on moments of discovery, but this was a moment of permission. Permission to pause, to feel without fixing, to think without concluding. Cannabis did not teach people how to think differently. It allowed them to stop trying so hard to think at all. And as these moments accumulated, they quietly prepared the ground for something more structured. Because once reflection becomes familiar, humans begin to ask whether it means something. And meaning, once invited, rarely stays quiet for long. As reflection became familiar, it began to change its shape. What had once been simple noticing slowly gathered weight. Not because anything new appeared, but because humans, as they always do, began to ask whether the experience itself carried meaning beyond the moment. Reflection, once gentle and private, started to lean toward interpretation. This is where smoke began to speak, not aloud, but through symbol. Cannabis had never claimed significance, yet significance gathered around it. People noticed that certain thoughts arrived more easily near the fire. Memories surfaced with unusual clarity. Dreams felt heavier, as if they carried messages instead of images. No one could say why, but the repetition was enough. When patterns repeat, humans begin to listen. Meaning did not arrive as doctrine. It arrived as poetry. Stories grew more layered. A fire was no longer just warmth. It became a meeting point between worlds. Smoke was no longer just smoke. It was a traveler, rising from earth towards sky, carrying breath, scent, and thought with it. Cannabis, quietly present in this imagery, became associated not with power, but with passage. Passage from one state to another. In gatherings shaped by this way of thinking, silence deepened. Words were chosen more carefully, not because they were sacred, but because they felt fragile. People spoke in metaphors long before they realized they were doing so. The mind, softened by smoke, moved less like a tool and more like a river. This was not belief in the modern sense. It was participation. To sit near the fire was to step into a space where the ordinary rules loosened slightly. Time stretched. Attention drifted. The boundary between inner and outer worlds blurred just enough to feel interesting, not frightening. Cannabis did not cause this shift, but it fit so naturally within it that separating the two became unnecessary. Here, humor returns quietly. Humans, after all, are experts at giving meaning to things that do not ask for it. A plant burns well, calms the body, softens thought, and soon it is part of stories about balance, harmony, and connection. Cannabis did not argue. It remained what it was, allowing humans to project significance onto its smoke. And projection, once started, rarely stops. Over time, cannabis became woven into moments that marked change, transitions between seasons, thresholds between youth and age, evenings that closed one chapter of life and mornings that opened another. Smoke accompanied these moments not as a signal, but as a companion. It did not announce transformation, it acknowledged it. This is where cannabis drifted closer to the symbolic world. Not because it demanded reverence, but because humans needed language for experiences that felt larger than explanation. Smoke became that language. Visible, fleeting, impossible to hold. Cannabis smoke, in particular, carried a gentle irony. It rose and disappeared, leaving no trace. Yet, the experience lingered. Meaning clung to memory rather than matter. This made it ideal for cultures that understood the world as layered, where not everything important could be touched or named. Still, restraint remained. Cannabis was not elevated above everything else. It joined other elements already rich with symbolism: fire, breath, night, repetition. It did not dominate these spaces. It complemented them. And because it did not overwhelm, it was trusted. Trust, in ancient cultures, did not mean certainty. It meant familiarity. Cannabis was familiar enough to feel safe, yet unpredictable enough to remain interesting. This balance kept it from becoming dangerous, both socially and spiritually. In these symbolic moments, people did not seek visions. They sought alignment, a sense that their inner state matched the outer world. When smoke drifted upward and thoughts drifted inward, the symmetry felt satisfying. Cannabis did not promise insight into the future. It offered presence in the moment. This distinction matters. Unlike substances that pushed experience to extremes, cannabis stayed near the center. It nudged rather than pulled. It whispered rather than shouted. And because of this, it became associated with listening to stories, to elders, to one's own thoughts. As symbolism grew, so did variation. Different groups interpreted these experiences differently. In some places, cannabis was linked to rest and recovery. In others, to creativity or communal bonding. There was no single narrative, and that flexibility allowed the plant to travel across cultures without losing relevance, meaning adapted to context. This adaptability is why cannabis survived changes in belief systems. When old stories faded, new ones took their place, and cannabis slipped between them easily. It never belonged to one explanation long enough to be trapped by it. By the end of this phase, cannabis had crossed an important threshold. It was no longer just something people did. It was something people talked about, remembered, and referenced when describing experiences that felt difficult to put into words. And yet, it remained gentle. There were no rigid rules, no strict rituals, no fear of misuse. Smoke still drifted freely, meaning remained flexible. The mystery was not solved, and that was precisely the point. Because once meaning hardens into certainty, it stops being curious, and curiosity was the quiet force guiding this entire journey. In the background of these symbolic gatherings, history continued to move. Trade routes expanded, cultures met, stories traveled. Cannabis, now carrying layers of interpretation, was about to step into a much wider world. And in that wider world, meaning would not remain quiet forever. For a long time, cannabis belonged to places rather than paths. It grew where it grew, used by those who lived nearby, woven quietly into local rhythms. But history rarely allows anything to remain still for very long. As people began to move more often and more deliberately, so did their plants, their habits, and their stories. This is when smoke began to travel. Trade did not begin as an exchange of goods alone. It was an exchange of familiarity. Seeds were carried not because they were valuable, but because they were known. Plants that behaved reliably, that did not spoil easily, that served multiple purposes, were far more likely to be packed alongside tools and textiles. Cannabis fit neatly into this category. It was useful, it was resilient, and by now it was meaningful.
As routes formed between communities, cannabis moved quietly with them, not announced as something special, but included almost absent-mindedly, the way one might carry a familiar spice or a trusted rope. Wherever people settled, the plant was planted. Wherever fires were lit, smoke followed. What changed was not cannabis itself, but the conversations around it. When a practice travels, it invites comparison. People notice differences. One group burns the plant casually. Another reserves it for quiet evenings. Another associates it with storytelling or rest. None of these approaches are declared correct or incorrect. They simply coexist, each reflecting the values of the people who hold them. Cannabis, once again, adapts. This phase of history is especially gentle because it lacks drama. There are no conquests driven by smoke, no sudden transformations. Instead, there is slow diffusion. Ideas drifting the way smoke does, changing shape, thinning, reappearing elsewhere. As cannabis moved across regions, it began to accumulate layers of interpretation. Stories from one place were retold in another, altered slightly to fit new landscapes and customs. Meaning traveled alongside the plant, but it did not arrive intact. It softened, it blended. This blending is where things become quietly fascinating. In some regions, cannabis was still treated as a practical companion used for fiber, fuel, or comfort. In others, it had begun to lean more towards symbolism. Neither view erased the other. They overlapped, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes seamlessly. Humans are remarkably tolerant of contradiction when it grows slowly enough. Cannabis could be ordinary and meaningful at the same time. A plant burned for warmth one evening might be associated with reflection the next. No one felt the need to resolve this tension. Life itself was full of contradictions, and smoke fit right in. As writing systems slowly emerged in some cultures, traces of cannabis began to appear not always clearly, not always prominently, but often enough to suggest familiarity. References were indirect, almost shy. The plant did not demand attention. It slipped into lists of materials, remedies, or customs without explanation. This subtlety is important. Cannabis did not enter history with declarations. It entered with assumptions. The assumption that readers already knew what it was, that its presence required no justification, that its role was understood well enough to go unnamed. This tells us something crucial about its place in daily life. Cannabis was not exotic to the people who used it. It was known. And when something is known, it rarely feels necessary to explain why it matters. Its meaning was carried through practice rather than proclamation. As trade expanded further, cannabis encountered belief systems far more structured than those it had known before. Some cultures welcomed it into existing frameworks, others observed it cautiously. Still others absorbed its practical uses while ignoring its symbolic associations entirely. The plant did not resist any of this. It remained cooperative, flexible, almost indifferent to how it was understood. This indifference allowed it to survive cultural shifts that would have erased more demanding practices. Cannabis asked for nothing. It offered what it always had. In this traveling phase, smoke became a shared experience across boundaries. People who did not share language or stories might still recognize the familiar scent near a fire. That recognition created a quiet sense of connection, even if no words were exchanged. Smoke, after all, does not require translation. What had once been a local presence was now part of a broader human pattern. Cannabis was no longer tied to one story or one place. It became a recurring element in the long narrative of movement, settlement, and exchange. And yet, despite this expansion, it remained small. Cannabis did not dominate trade routes or shape economies in obvious ways. It was never the main character. It was the background detail, the object that appears again and again if you know where to look. This is why its history feels elusive. It does not announce itself. It must be noticed. And noticing requires patience, the same patience with which cannabis had always been used. By the end of this phase, cannabis had become something rare in history, widely present but lightly held. Known across regions, yet interpreted locally. Useful without being essential. Meaningful without being rigid. It had learned how to travel without losing its quiet nature. And that skill would soon be tested. Because as societies grew more complex and belief systems more formal, there would be less room for ambiguity. Practices would be named, categorized, and judged. Smoke, once free to drift, would eventually be asked to explain itself. But for now, it continued its journey, unnoticed by history's loudest moments, yet woven deeply into its slowest ones. As cannabis continued its quiet journey across regions and generations, something subtle but decisive began to happen. The world around it grew louder. Societies became more structured. Belief systems hardened. Rules, once fluid, began to settle into fixed shapes. And when that happened, anything that lived comfortably in ambiguity found itself in an uneasy position. Smoke, by its nature, resists clarity. For a long time, cannabis had survived precisely because it asked no questions and demanded no definitions. It drifted between uses, meanings, and cultures with remarkable ease. But as humans began to draw firmer lines between what was acceptable and what was not, that ease became a problem. This is where myth enters the story. Myth does not always arrive as a grand narrative. Sometimes it appears as suspicion, a whispered warning, a half-remembered story passed along with a raised eyebrow. Cannabis, once familiar and gently present, began to attract interpretations that said more about human fear than about the plant itself. When experiences are difficult to explain, they are often explained away. Cannabis had always softened perception, slowed time, and invited reflection. In more open cultural spaces, these qualities were welcomed. But in societies increasingly concerned with order, productivity, and moral clarity, such effects became unsettling. Anything that loosened the grip of certainty was treated with caution. And so smoke began to change its role. Not because it changed, but because the stories around it did. In some places, cannabis was absorbed into mythic frameworks, its effects attributed to unseen forces rather than human experience. In others, it was quietly pushed aside, mentioned less often, written about more carefully. Silence became a strategy. This silence was not always enforced. Often, it was chosen. Practices that once lived openly around shared fires were moved into private spaces. What had been communal became individual. What had been ordinary became something to be explained, justified, or hidden. This shift marks a profound turning point. Cannabis did not disappear from history at this moment. It simply became harder to see. References grew indirect. Language softened or avoided specificity. The plant slipped into metaphor, into coded mention, into stories where its name was unnecessary because its presence was already understood by those who needed to know. Myth thrives in these gaps. When information thins, imagination thickens. Cannabis began to appear in tales that exaggerated its qualities, both positive and negative. In some stories, it became a source of inspiration or insight. In others, a cause of confusion or moral weakness. The plant itself remained unchanged, but its reputation became elastic. This elasticity served an important function. By transforming cannabis into myth, societies could keep it at a distance. They could talk about it without confronting the ambiguity it represented. Myths allowed people to frame experience in moral terms rather than experiential ones. Something was no longer simply felt, it was judged. And judgment brings silence with it. As belief systems grew more authoritative, practices that did not fit neatly within them were quietly sidelined. Cannabis, which had never asked to be defined, was now being defined in ways that limited its presence. Its earlier roles as companion, mirror, traveler were not erased, but they were obscured. Still, traces remained. In folk practices, in regional customs, in songs and sayings that survived without explanation. Cannabis continued to exist in the margins, carried forward by familiarity rather than approval. It was remembered by those who had reason to remember. What is striking is how gently this happened. There were no sudden bans that wiped cannabis from daily life everywhere at once. Instead, there was a gradual narrowing of space. Fewer public fires, fewer shared pauses, more emphasis on clarity, control, and visible purpose. Smoke, once welcome, now needed justification. And justification is rarely kind to subtlety. As cannabis slipped further into silence, it gained a new kind of power, not through use, but through absence. Things that are not spoken about often carry more weight than those discussed openly. The mystery deepened, not because cannabis became more mysterious, but because fewer people felt comfortable naming it. This is one of history's quiet ironies. Cannabis had always existed comfortably without explanation. It was human systems that demanded explanation and then struggled with the answers. In trying to impose meaning, they created distance. In trying to control interpretation, they created myth. And myth, once formed, rarely fades quickly. By the end of this phase, cannabis occupied a strange position in human culture. It was neither forgotten nor fully present. It lingered in the background, wrapped in stories that were often inconsistent, sometimes contradictory, and rarely complete. It had become something people knew about, but did not always talk about. Yet, even in silence, continuity remained. Practices passed quietly between generations. Knowledge survived in hands rather than texts. The plant endured, patient as ever, waiting for a time when ambiguity might once again be tolerated. History, after all, moves in cycles. Periods of openness give way to periods of restraint. What is hidden is eventually rediscovered. Smoke, though invisible, leaves traces on memory, and memory has a way of resurfacing when conditions allow. As this session closes, the story begins to turn inward again. After travel, after myth, after silence, comes reflection of a different kind. Not the reflection of early fires, but the reflection of distance, of looking back and wondering how something so quiet managed to persist at all. And that question lingers softly, like smoke after the fire is burned low. By the time cannabis settled into myth and silence, it had already lived many lives. It had warmed fires, softened evenings, followed people across distances, and slipped quietly into moments of reflection and meaning. It had never demanded attention, and perhaps because of that, it endured. Now, as history slowed its pace, cannabis seemed to do the same. This final stage is not about disappearance, but about stillness. Smoke, after all, does not vanish abruptly. It thins, it lingers. It drifts upward until it blends with the air and becomes indistinguishable from it. Cannabis reached this point in human history not as a dramatic ending, but as a gentle settling. People no longer gathered openly around it as they once had. Fires grew smaller, both literally and metaphorically. Life became more regulated, more measured, more concerned with clarity and control. In such a world, the quiet ambiguity cannabis offered felt out of place. And so, it waited. Waiting, in history, is not inactivity. It is patience. Cannabis continued to exist in private spaces, in inherited habits, in half-remembered traditions passed down without explanation. It was there in the background of daily life, no longer guiding conversation, but not entirely absent either. This quiet persistence is perhaps its most remarkable quality. Cannabis did not resist being misunderstood. It did not argue against myth or silence. It allowed stories to form around it, even when those stories distorted its past. In doing so, it remained available for rediscovery. Anything too rigid risks breaking when the world changes. Cannabis, flexible as smoke, bent instead. From a distance, this period feels calm. Not empty, but subdued. The kind of calm that comes after long movement, when the body finally rests and the mind drifts without purpose. Cannabis mirrored that state. It stopped traveling. It stopped accumulating meaning. It simply existed. And existence, when stripped of explanation, can be restful. In this quiet phase, cannabis returned to something close to its earliest role. Not a symbol, not a remedy, not a mystery to be solved. Just a presence, familiar enough to be trusted, gentle enough to be ignored when necessary. History often rewards loudness, but it is shaped just as much by what remains quiet. Cannabis survived not because it was powerful, but because it was adaptable. It fit into human lives without demanding center stage. It allowed itself to be forgotten and remembered, hidden and revealed, used and set aside. This ability to move between visibility and obscurity kept it alive through centuries of change. As the story draws to a close, there is no final revelation waiting, no truth uncovered at the last moment, only a sense of continuity. Smoke rises, thins, and disappears, but the fire leaves warmth behind. Experiences fade, but memory keeps their outline. Perhaps that is the most fitting ending. Cannabis was never meant to be a conclusion. It was a companion to moments of rest, of reflection, of quiet connection, and companions do not announce their departure. They simply remain part of the journey even after the journey seems to have ended. As you listen now, there is no need to hold on to the details of this history. Let them drift the way smoke does. Some will linger, some will fade. That is how stories meant for rest behave. History does not always move forward with noise and urgency. Sometimes it exhales. Sometimes it grows quiet. Sometimes it invites sleep. And in that soft, lingering quiet, the smoke finally rests. You can rest too.